Now this presentation, as you can see, is also the title of my book, Hidden History of Flint, and this photo you see is from the early 1920s of part of downtown Flint where most of these buildings are gone. For example, now this is still standing. That's the old Genesee County Savings Bank building, which was built in 1920, and you may have heard that it may become a hotel if everything goes well. The large building on the left here, that was Flint's very first skyscraper, first called the Flint P. Smith Building, and later called the Sill Building. That was torn down to make way for redevelopment of what was first called Water Street Pavilion, is now the University Pavilion. You can go to the next slide. Now, Flint's first white settler was Jacob Smith, who set up a trading post along the Flint River to trade with the local Chippewa people. Jacob Smith had a family in Detroit. This is a drawing from the Flint Board of Education textbook from the early 1950s called Tales of Early Flint. No known photo of Jacob Smith is known to exist from life, so hence I have this drawing to work with.
What year was that?
This would be the early 1800s. If you go to the next slide, you can see that previous one. Now, this map shows the Flint River. Jacob Smith had a hand in the drawing of the Chippewa Treaty of 1819, which ceded most of the land to what was in the territory of Michigan. This is from the abstract from my very own home. You can see it says sketch of the reservations at or near the Grand Traverse of Flint, Michigan, and Michigan Territory. Now, all these plots of land along the river, the lot numbers, you can see in capital letters the Chippewa names of the people who the land was bequeathed to. But if you note on the bottom, I'll just note here, over here, if you look on the bottom where it says Smith, 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 they were allotted to Jacob Smith's children. So you can see that there were ulterior motives that Jacob Smith had. I'm sure that the Chippewa people were not happy with how things turned out. Next slide. Now, what I'm wearing is something that Jacob Smith and or Chief Naomi could have worn. That is a wool coat called a capote because it has this hood. That's the French word for hood is capote. And it was made using a wool blanket, including wool blankets made by the Hudson's Bay Company, which was available to fur traders, and they were traded to the native peoples in exchange for what was popularly known as beaver pelts. And the French-Canadian voyagers and the native peoples made these blankets into coats like this one. And this photo I took was taken at Mount Park, and as you can see from the caption, if you go to the Wikipedia article on either Hudson's Bay Point blankets or capote, C-A-P-O-T-E, you'll see me wearing my coat. Now, my editors at the History Press did not want more recent photos. They preferred photos like the next one you see here. This is a turn of the 20th century photo of Little Blackfeet, also known as William Jackson, wearing a wool capote similar to this one while sitting on a horse. This is a marvelous slide. It could have been tinted. I didn't know they had color photography at the turn of the 20th century, but you can probably see on the left where it came from if you look over on the side here. But that was what my editors preferred and for illustrations for my Hidden History of Flint book. We can go to the next. Now this is a scene of downtown Flint. This is the intersection of South Saginaw Street at Kersley. This is Kersley Street. And this building here, that was the Fenton building, which wound up that whole block. In fact, if you look here on the side, you can see a bit of the Smith-Bridgman sign, so that's the Smith-Bridgman store. Over there, that's the Dryden building, which is still standing, although it kind of lost the story. I'll mention that in a little bit. But what's significant about the Fenton building here is, go to the next slide, that was the location of Fenton Hall, which was Flint's very first theater. As you can see, it was kind of a rudimentary setup. The stage was kind of small, so they couldn't hold any grand presentations. So eventually, a more grander theater was built, which I'll talk about further along in my presentation. And so we'll go to the next slide. And these two people...
Was that theater a home for vaudeville at the time?
Well, it could have had vaudeville, but it was just too inadequate to be a vaudeville. Although many notable speakers were at Fenton Hall. Yeah, that's Fenton Hall.
Yeah.
You can see that the stage was kind of on the small side.
Just doing its own thing.
Having a little trouble with the keyboard. Yeah, here we go. That's Fenton Hall. Now, many entertainers and politicians performed at Fenton Hall. As you can see by the small size of the stage, it was just too inadequate for more grander productions. So now we'll go to the next slide and see those two people. By the way, this drawing was made by our own videographer, Jenny Munch. And those two people are actually one and the same. On the left, that is Franklin Thompson, which was actually an alias of a woman named Sarah Edmonds. During the Civil War, Sarah Edmonds enlisted in a Michigan Army Brigade to fight for the Union, and she served as a man named Franklin Thompson, as a nurse and a spy. She became very successful in her missions. However, she contracted malaria while serving and had to desert and seek treatment as a civilian and as a woman. She spent the rest of the war as a woman, serving as a nurse. But because of wanted posters and deserters at that time risked being shot if caught, she spent the remainder of the war as a woman. After the war, it took several years for the powers that be to be convinced that Sarah Edmonds and Franklin Thompson were one and the same. Eventually, she did get a pension. The law was passed to get that, and she wound up being the first, actually the only woman member of the Civil War Veterans Organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. I will go to the next slide. And these two sides of the historical marker can be found on the grounds of the Genesee County Courthouse, and I'll allow time for the audience here to read what those markers read, which is basically a profile of Sarah Edmonds on the left and her alias as a man, Franklin Thompson. So let us know when you're ready, and then we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
You can raise your hand if you're done reading. Okay, I guess everyone who are able to read can read it. So next slide, please. This was one of two amusement parks Flint had. On the southeast side along Thread Lake, this is Lakeside Park. And this was taken around 1920. Lakeside Park, as you can see, here's a roller coaster. I'll just trace the roller coaster. And as you can see, part of the roller coaster was right over Thread Lake. There's also a ball field. There's a ball field here. And this looks like a track over here. And it looks like a pavilion over here. Lakeside Park was one of two amusement parks, but it closed during the Great Depression. And the city took it over for back taxes, and it was absorbed with an adjacent park, Thread Lake Park, and now it is Lakeside Park. However, it doesn't get much use because I-475 is in the way, so you have to take side streets to get to what is now McKinley Park. Understand that Thread Lake is used during the winter by motorcycle ice racers. And Thread Lake was also used to harvest ice before refrigeration became prevalent. So, next slide, please. This is a very familiar factory. This was known for several years as Fish Body Plant Number 1. But before then, this factory was built by Billy Durant to build the Flint automobile. In fact, you can see a line of Flint automobiles that were destined for shipment to a dealership in Bay City. Unfortunately for Durant and that factory, the volume of sales was too small for this regarding the size of the factory, and so it was sold to General Motors and became Fish Body Plant Number 1 for several years. Next slide, please. Durant Motors made several different product lines, like General Motors did, and the higher end model was called the Durant. You can see it was a very impressive looking vehicle, and you can see the rather simple slogan for the Durant automobile. And you can see the Durant shield, which I think at one time was mounted on the administration building of what later became Fisher Body Plant Number 1.
Where's the shield?
Yeah, so I'll show you the shield. Here it is. Point it out. And we'll go to the next slide, and we'll see a portrait of Billy Durant himself at the time that he was running Durant Motors. And now we'll go to the next slide and see the operations of his business partner, J. Dallas Dort. They were partners of the Durant Dort Carriage Company. But when the Durant Dort Carriage Company stopped making carriages, J. Dallas Dort was using the factories to build the Dort automobile. And you can see here, this was around the 1920s, and you can see the prices for the car. Those are pretty good prices, but that was way back then. We'll go to the next slide. And that was where J. Dallas Dort lived on East Kearsley Street, in a rather imposing looking two-story home. In the 1950s, his widow donated the house for use as a music school. It became the Dort Music Building. Late in the 1960s, they made expansion plans for what would become the Dort Music Center. But during construction in 1970, the old Dort family home burned down. But the Flint Institute of Music in the Dort Music Center is still standing on the site of the Dort home. And this shows how J. Dallas Dort was not only an industrialist and a Flint booster, but he was also a music maven. We'll go to the next slide, and that's J. Dallas Dort himself. Flint had another carriage maker of note. We'll go to the next slide. That's William A. Patterson. He started with a small carriage business, which wound up taking up two large buildings on either side of East 3rd Street at Harrison Street. We'll go to the next slide. And this is one of the factories. This was factory number 1. Now, on this side, that was East 3rd Street. And on this side over here, that's Harrison Street. The Patterson Company would also later on build motor vehicles. I'll talk more about that later on. And this building would eventually become the Pengali Building, which became the center of organized labor. I'll talk about that in a little while. We'll go to the next slide. And this was the Patterson motor car from 1917. So he made motor vehicles, but unfortunately, after William Patterson died, his son could make a go of it. It was sold, but before long, the Patterson Company just closed up shop. Next slide, please. Well, by the way, I should add as an aside that he was also a real estate developer. He owned among other structures, the Dragon Building, which is still standing at the corner of 2nd Street and Saginaw Street, which now is a very active renovated building. Now this building you see on the left-hand side, that was the original home of Smith, Bridgman and Company, which was founded in 1862. And this is obviously a 60th anniversary ad for Smith Bridgman from 1922. Go to the next slide. And this was how the Smith Bridgmans looked in 1926 when the 7-story building, which I don't know if maybe some of you are old enough to remember how this looked. However, it would grow even further. You can probably see the original Smith Bridgman store. I'll just highlight it. Here we go. So this is the original store. I'll circle the old sign on the side of the building. And we'll go to the next slide. You can see on the left an addition that was built to the store. On the right-hand side, you can see the S.S. Cressy Company Annex store, but it would not stand for long because in the next slide, you can see the Smith Bridgman building as most of us remember it, with a kind of plain, modern-looking facade replacing the more ornate facade with all the windows. Now, Smith Bridgman did not just occupy that large building. It had 2 annex stores. We'll go to the next slide. And this was the First Street store, located on East First Street between Brush Alley. This is Brush Alley. You can see the Mount Foundation building to the right. And on the left, you can see partially the Garden Theater, which was built in 1939 on the old site of the Bijou Theater, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it closed in 1957 because of the rise of television, and it would be torn down in 1966 to make room for Genesee Towers, which I'll talk about later on. And you can see on the right-hand side, well, that was Bill Lamb's record shop. This is Bill Lamb's record shop here. It moved to Harrison Street when it got relocated. Now we'll go to the Harrison Street Annex on the next slide. And it had entrances both on Harrison Street, and you could also access it from the back of the Smith Bridgman store along Brush Alley. And I'll just show, in this store they sold furniture, appliances, radios, TV. I can't read what it says here, but it looks like paint over here. So they sold major appliances at this annex store. And we'll go to the next slide. Unfortunately, Smith Bridgman's parent company made some bad business moves, and the Smith Bridgman store closed by around 1980, as well as the sister stores in Lansing, Battle Creek, and Owasso. They were called Knapp's in Lansing, DM Christian in Owasso, and Robinson's in Battle Creek. And this was the flagship downtown store being torn down around 1984 to make room for the parking lot that took up the whole block, that now takes up the whole block. But the building I most miss is this one. That was the Milner Arcade, which was a hodgepodge of different architectural styles. So that was the building that I missed the most at the corner of, this is the corner of Saginaw Street, and this would be East First Street over on this side.
What were some of the bad decisions they made?
Yeah, there were several bad decisions made over the years.
No, but I say, do you remember what they were? Or?
Oh yes, I do remember that all too well. I'm 63 years old, so I do remember how downtown Flint looked back then.
No, I'm saying, what were the bad decisions?
Oh, well, Auto World is one. Water Street Pavilion didn't quite make a go of it. Windmill Place didn't last. That was north of the river, along Saginaw and Fifth Avenue. So those are 3 I can think of. We'll go to the next slide. The oldest institution that calls Flint home is Michigan School for the Deaf. And this was the original Michigan School for the Deaf building, but unfortunately it was destroyed by fire. And that was not the only one. Other buildings were built on that campus, such as, next slide, the original Brown Hall at the Michigan School for the Deaf. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'll show you the oldest surviving building, which was the superintendent's cottage, which was built in 1890. It was built with the help of students at MSD. Now, MSD has evolved over the years, and the next slide will show how the main MSD building looks nowadays. And it shares the campus for budget reasons. They now share the campus with another well-known institution in this area. Next slide. That's the current location of Powers Catholic High School. This is the historic Fay Hall, which was part of the Michigan School for the Deaf, but because of budget cutbacks and falling enrollment, that building was disused for many, many years. When Powers took it over, they made it into a modern classroom facility and made the 100-year-old building good for another 100 years, added on to this addition to make Powers Catholic High School a very desirable facility for education, and it's very handy to get to from I-69. We'll go to the next slide. This was the Chevy in the Hole complex, which was the location for industry for over a century, with many different industries, including carriage making and later automobiles. Now, along here, that's West Kearsley Street, and Glenwood Avenue would be over here. I think that's Asylum Street over here. That's what is now Chevrolet Avenue. That's what is now Stevenson Street. Of course, when General Motors closed their factories one by one, those factory buildings were torn down one by one. The north side of the river, next slide, was claimed by Kettering University, and they're developing the GM Mobility Research Center, which is proving grounds to aid students, faculty, and staff at Kettering so they can have real-world testing experience with those proving grounds which are being developed. The south side of the old Chevy in the Hole, south of the river, go to the next slide. That's now Chevy Commons, which is being developed as a nature area and parkland, which eventually have a bike path going through. There's already a bike path leading to Chevy Commons, which is the old Grand Trunk right-of-way, which runs along the old right-of-way from Chevrolet Avenue to the east, all the way down to Flint Township, all the way to Genesee Valley and beyond on the west. We'll go to the next slide. In the 1950s, there was a proposal to deal with the Flint area's growth, and Flint had the idea, which did not work out. You can see this Flint's boundaries in 1958, and that shaded area you see here, that was what they were proposing as New Flint, to greatly enlarge the city, taking up all of Grand Plain Township, part of Bundy Township, most of Flint Township, all of Burton Township, all of Genesee Township, most of Mount Morris Township, and little bits of Vienna and Thetford Township. Unfortunately for the proponents, it ran into a big roadblock in the courts because you couldn't annex incorporated cities like Grand Blanc down here and Mount Morris up there without approval of those two cities, and both of them objected, so that proposal went away. In the early 1970s, there was a proposal, a series of proposals for Flint Township, Burton Township, and Genesee Township to incorporate into cities. Flint Township would be called Carmen, Genesee Township, Genesee, and Burton Township, Burton. But only one township managed to get their proposal passed, thanks to, next slide, this kind of convincing and rather busy ad calling for Burton Township voters to approve incorporation into a city. You can see this fat pig representing City of Flint politicians who has the South Flint Plaza in its vest pocket, which was part of Burton Township before the City of Flint annexed it. And they had their eyes on the Eastland Mall Shopping Center, which is now Cortland Center, and the expansion of AC Sparkplug east of Center Road, which, as you can see here, says Burton Township's only two large taxpayers. And Burton Township at that time had about 30,000 people. So they were successful thanks to that ad, and the following year, the city of Burton was incorporated. We'll go to the next slide. The longest serving dairy that the Flint area had was McDonald Dairy. And in 1940, they had this ad that shows that drinking McDonald's cream milk is kind of healthy. You can see on the top it says, rich in the vitamins that help ward off colds. It keeps your resistance higher. One sure way to fortify your family against colds is to build up the resistance with vitamin A. Cream milk is rich in this vitamin and many others that promote good health, available exclusively at McDonald Dairy. Eventually, McDonald Dairy would be sold and would become the Country Dairy, which unfortunately, Country Fresh Dairy was sold by Dean Foods and closed that dairy factory, which now is being renovated, and I understand it may be a factory that builds prefabricated homes out of used shipping containers.
Oh, yeah.
So that factory along Chavez Drive, parallel to I-475, is still getting some good use. Next slide, please. This gentleman was James Hurley, who was a successful businessman, and when he died, he bequeathed funds. For example, he donated funds to every church, regardless of faith, but most significantly, he donated a plot of land west of downtown for the construction of, next slide, the original Hurley Hospital, which over the years has expanded greatly, but this was how Hurley Hospital originally looked. When James Hurley died, he was buried along with his wife, who had died about a couple of years before, at Old Calvary Cemetery, which is the oldest surviving cemetery in the Flint area. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is what the Hurley plot looks like today. He was buried at the turn of the 20th century at the edge of a ravine, but over the course of the several decades, that ravine became, it had been eroded into the ravine. So it reached the point by the turn of the 20th century, if you tried to visit that grave, you have to be very careful because of the steep incline. The Diocese of Lansing, which operates Old Calvary Cemetery, were very much aware of that. It took several years, and you have to be very careful to try to be respectful of the deceased, but they built a retaining wall, as you can see, and new fencing, and re-landscaped the plot. So now the Hurley plot, you can see that the graves of James Hurley and his wife are now a very nicely landscaped plot over at Old Calvary Cemetery, which is located on Ballinger Highway between the Flint River and Flushing Road. We'll go to the next slide. Now this gentleman was Flint's most prolific inventor. His name is Lloyd Copeman, and he's demonstrating his most lucrative invention, the flexible ice cube tray he's holding with his left hand here, and he's holding a rubber boot in his right hand. He came up with that idea when he was collecting tree sap during the winter, and noticed that the ice was flaking off his boots instead of sticking. That allowed him to come up with the idea, so he took some little cups and little rubber cups, froze them, and after they were frozen, they just slipped right off. So he sold a patent for the flexible ice cube tray to General Motors, which at that time owned Frigidaire, and earned about $1 million in royalties as a result. So, but that's not the only thing Lloyd Copeman invented. We have two examples here which are on display at the Hadley Mill Museum in Hadley, in Lapeer County. On the bottom you see the electric stove that Copeman invented. He actually had a factory in Flint which made them, but he was unsuccessful in marketing them, so he sold the company to Westinghouse, which moved the factory out of town. And another invention I'll point out to you, that is a toaster, an electric toaster, which turned the toast automatically. That idea was made obsolete when the pop-up toaster was invented. And I understand that the Copeman stove, there's another one on display at the Sloan Museum. So, next slide, please. You recognize these 5 individuals as Groucho, Zeppo, Harpo, Chico, and you may not recognize Gummo. A century ago, they were itinerant vaudevillians who traveled in towns large and small, in theaters large and small, and they made several stops in Flint. And I'll show you in the next slide where they performed. They first performed, I think around 1911 and 1913, at the Bijou Theater, which was Flint's very first vaudeville theater. This is East First Street, and that is Harrison Street. In 1915, they performed at the larger Stone's Opera House over here. Stone's Opera House is located where the Flint Drill Building was later built, and is now the home of the Michigan State University Med School.
Wasn't that building, I have an old photograph about 1915 that turned into a movie theater.
Yes, it was later on a movie theater,
Right.
as well as it was renovated into a vaudeville theater.
Right.
And that was where the Marx Brothers performed, at what was then called the Majestic Theater.
Yeah. Interesting, on my photograph, in the display windows, they were advertising that John Philip Sousa was coming into town in 1915 to give a concert.
Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. In fact, architecturally, the long-gone Stone's Opera House, which I believe was torn down in 1923, was identical to a theater that is still standing in Coldwater, Michigan, called Tibbetts Opera House. And in recent years, that was restored to how it looked originally, similar to the Bijou, the Stone's Opera House here. It had the same front facade, and in research, they had the same architect. Tibbetts Opera House suffered what may consider a worse fate than demolition, modernization. They gave it about an Art Deco facade in the 1930s. In the 1950s, when TV came along, that theater closed and was threatened with demolition, but some civic-minded individuals in Coldwater saved it. They put up a temporary brick facade in the 1960s until they could raise enough funds to restore the facade to how it looked originally. They made a video which was broadcast by Delta College Channel 19 not too long ago. I recorded it, and it was very impressive. As a side note, they replaced the steel on the facade with copper so that it would not rust. Now, back to Majestic Theater. We'll go to the next slide. And this was the ad for the Majestic Theater, which you see here says formerly Stone Theater. That showed all 5 Marx Brothers. You can see 5, in the big musical review, Home Again. That was the only known time that all 5 Marx Brothers, including at that time 14-year-old Zeppo, appeared on stage for the only time on the same stage. During World War I, Gummo quit the act to enter military service, and Zeppo took over as the 4th Marx Brother. Next slide, please. Now, these sets of stones, which are very close together, don't have anyone buried there. Those stones, including that broken stone, which I believe of a Civil War casualty, those were originally buried at the first city cemetery that Flint had, which was located on what was then called Lewis Street, not far from Avondale Cemetery, where the stones were relocated. In the 1950s, the old city cemetery site was redeveloped. The remains were moved to the new city cemetery at the corner of Linden Road near Pasadena Avenue. And the stones were moved to Avondale Cemetery. The site was donated, actually sold to the owner of Quartz Glass and Paint. And eventually, eastbound Longway Boulevard was relocated to make way for the I-475 Expressway. And what is now the Holiday Inn Express, when that was built, during construction, they found even more remains from the old city cemetery. So they had to be really relocated to the new city cemetery on Linden Road. Next slide, please. At the turn of the 20th century, East Kearsley Street was the home of several notable Flint executives. Unfortunately, almost all of these homes, with the exception of the Whaley House, as well as the Applewood Estate at the other end of East Kearsley Street, those were the only ones still standing. There may be a couple of other vintage houses still standing, more closer to the intersection of Kearsley Street and Crapo. But the development of the College and Cultural Center, as well as the construction of I-475 and the development of University of Michigan Flint campus, pretty much decimated all those executive homes. One of those executives who lived on East Kearsley Street at that time, next slide, was J. Bradford Pengali, who, well, on this caption it says Reverend J. Bradford Pengali, because at the time this photo was taken, he was pastor at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. However, he decided to change careers, and he became a real estate developer. In fact, he was the head of a group which developed the Capitol Theater, which they're just about done restoring. In fact, I think it's, you may have heard about it, on December 8th, Friday, December 8th, they're going to have the very first show at the restored Capitol Theater, a big holiday spectacular. In fact, Yvonne and I got a pair of tickets for it. Today they're available at the Whiting Box Office while supplies last. As an aside, the main floor, except for the handicap seating, are reserved for those who are actively involved in the restoration of the Capitol Theater, both the organizers, the workmen, and all the other people directly involved in the restoration, and the general public, handicap notwithstanding, they can sit in the balcony. J. Bradford Pengali, among his other real estate developments, we'll go to the next slide. He was the owner of the former factory number 1, this one, that became the Pengali building. Here you can see the Capitol Theater, and across the 3rd Street, here's that other Patterson factory I was talking about, factory number 2. When the Patterson company closed, factory number 2 on the left became the Brownson Fisher building, which was an office building on the upper floors, and for many years Brownson Fisher Wallpaper and Paint on the main floor. As for the Pengali building, there was retail space on the main floor and office space on the upper floors. Several labor organizations and labor unions were located in the Pengali building. In fact, the Pengali building was the place where the Flint sit-down strike was organized. But even then in 1936, the Pengali building was kind of a rickety structure. In fact, there were plans to fix up the Pengali building, but World War II broke out, and the government would not allow anything to be done to the Pengali building, so it wound up being all boarded up, and it was torn down after World War II. There was a parking lot for several years because of material shortages, but then in the early 1950s, a Hamley supermarket was built on that site. That building is today the Ennis Center for Children, which is an adoption agency. We'll go to the next slide. This was how the Palace Theater originally looked when it was built in 1917. The marquee here looks like to be of a 1930s design. And this picture was taken, as you can see, in 1947, which was the year of the 1947 flood. Now, I was hoping to use that photo, but unfortunately I could never locate who owned that slide, so I couldn't use it in my book. But in 1950, the Vaudeville theater chain, which owned the Palace Theater, decided it was looking a bit too old-fashioned. Now I should mention that the Palace Theater, as originally looked, had the same architect as the Capitol Theater, which was located 2 blocks to the south along Harrison Street, John Everson, who came up with the atmospheric theater design, of which the Capitol Theater and the Palace Theater was an early example. In fact, over at the Genesee County Historical Society, they have a book called Picture Palaces and Movie Houses. I think that was the title. And it has photos of the Capitol and the Palace Theater. And they showed the Palace Theater as it looked outside and inside. They modernized the theater inside and out in 1950, so next slide. This is how it wound up looking after they changed the front facade, and they turned it into Art Deco with the yellow and red tiles. You can see the blade sign saying Palace and the modern all-glass marquee. In the mid-1970s, with the development of the University of Michigan Flint campus, there were condemnation proceedings for the Palace Theater, and when the city took it over and turned it over to university, there were calls for the university to utilize the theater as part of the campus. The theater seated about 1,300, but the university officials decided that, well, it was just too expensive to renovate the Palace Theater and bring the 60-year-old theater up to code. Besides, they did not anticipate the need for an assembly hall as large as the Palace Theater, so it was sadly torn down. This was located at the corner of Kersley Street and Harrison Street. And the site is now landscaped with a diagonal sidewalk and a University of Michigan Flint sign. Go to the next slide. This is another Flint landmark, which is long gone. Flint's second high school, Flint Northern High School, which was located on McClellan Street, just east of what was at that time called Detroit Street, which is now Martin Luther King Avenue. In the 1960s, Northern High shared the same campus as Garfield School, which would be located on the left, and Emerson Junior High behind it along Pasadena Avenue. And with that overcrowded campus, the Flint Board of Education decided to relocate Northern High School to the west side of town on Mackin Road, which, go to the next slide, looked like that. Unfortunately, shrinking enrollment in the Flint schools led to the closing of Northern High School, as well as Central High School. Northwestern Academy and Southwestern Academy, they're still high school serving the Flint students. There is talk about taking the old Central High School site at the College and Cultural Center and make it Flint's only high school. I hope they at least keep the walls so we still have a bit of history of Flint Central, which was, and it's still a grand building, even though as it looks inside, it's in sorry shape. We'll go to the next slide. Now here's a landmark in Flint that is still standing, Atwood Stadium. At that time, Atwood Stadium also had a baseball field, as you can see from that diamond I just highlighted. But in recent years, due to deferred maintenance, it was all deteriorated. But Kettering University came to the rescue, so they took over the Atwood Stadium, and go to the next slide, they fixed it up. So you can see they got the press box looking very good. They got all new bleachers. You see a nice artificial turf, which is serves for both football and soccer. And note over here, a modern locker room over here. That's the scoreboard. And some nice fencing, as you can see. There is a rock that they uncovered during the renovation. They decided to keep it at that location, and I think there's a plaque on that rock. You can't see it because of the angle, but it shows why the rock was there. Go to the next slide. This is a north side landmark. This is along North Saginaw Street, and from the 1920s onward, Burston Field House was a place for recreation. There were two basketball courts on either side of the field house, a boxing ring in the basement. Upstairs there are various facilities such as the dance school, which is there now. There used to be a swimming pool, that's long gone. And in the back there's a ball field, as well as a paved area for practicing basketball. And as you can see above the entrance, Clarissa Shields, the two-time gold medalist, she trained at Person's Fieldhouse's basement. And the basketball courts were the incubators of champions, such as Bettine Cleaves and the rest of the Flintstones, who led Michigan State to an NBA championship. And that's still, even though it does show its age, the volunteers keep Person Fieldhouse going. Go to the next slide. This building is still standing at this is North Saginaw Street at 2nd Avenue here. This was the Industrial Savings Bank. Today it's part of North Bank Center. In the 1920s, the Industrial Savings Bank, well, they had employees who decided to, quote, invest, unquote, in the stock market. Later on in the 1920s, Industrial Savings Bank merged with Union Trust and Savings Bank to form Union Industrial Bank, which was headed, well, Charles Stewart Mott was the largest stockholder. And the 1929 stock market crash, well, let's just say that those who invested bank funds in the stock market got into big trouble. Charles Stewart Mott fired them, and he did something which led to the praise of state officials and the city fathers. He took the exact amount of the losses and withdrew funds from his private bank account in Detroit, and with armored cars in tow, he sent the money over to Union Industrial Bank to reimburse the losses. Unfortunately for the Union Industrial Bank, it did not survive the Great Depression. It and another failed bank, the First National Bank of Flint, those deposits were freed up by the formation of a new bank. Next slide. The National Bank of Flint. And as you can see on its logo over here, it proudly stated that it was established January 30th, 1934. And how do you like a 4% mortgage from the 1930s? During World War II, the National Bank of Flint was sold by Lansing-based Michigan National Bank. Over the years, it would be absorbed into larger banks. The Michigan National Bank became Standard Federal Bank, which became LaSalle Bank, which was taken over by Bank of America. And in a reversal of what you normally see with bank acquisitions, go to the next slide. Bank of America, which was the object of ridicule because as a $1 trillion mega bank, it turned out to be a mean bank. You may have seen a news story about a Civil War soldier serving in Afghanistan, and his house was foreclosed on despite a law forbidding that. So Bank of America sold its local branches to the Huntington National Bank. And this was the weekend when the Huntington branches were created from the Bank of America branches. So you can see the new ATM over here, the new sign on the bank, but note on the top, they hadn't gotten around to refacing the Bank of America signs yet, but they would later on that day. And by the way, I have these Huntington bank pens to give away as I sign the books. As you may know, Huntington took over First Merit Bank, which was formerly Citizens Bank, amazingly, only 2 overlapping branches were closed. A First Merit across from the Great Lakes Technology Center on South Saginaw, and a Huntington in Grand Blanc across from the Grand Mall. All the other First Merit branches in the Flint area were converted into Huntington branches, although they still have not refaced the weather ball, although some people like it to stay FM, standing for Flint, Michigan. So we'll go to the next slide. This was the location of the Flint Farmers Market, for many years, starting from the 1930s. It was located along, that's Robert T. Longway here, that's Boulevard Drive, and to the left, out of the picture, the Flint River. But by the turn of the 20th century, while the Flint Farmers Market was very popular on Boulevard Drive, the utilities were all maxed out. The electrical was maxed out, the plumbing was maxed out, and that two-story section over here was not ADA compliant because it had no elevator. And so they relocated the Flint Farmers Market down, they moved it more directly downtown in the old Flint Journal printing and distribution facility along First Street, and it's now more popular than ever. And now it's a great magnet for people going downtown. We'll go to the next slide. Now this is a building that, well, a little bit of it is still standing. This was the State Theater, which was located on South Saginaw Street between First Street and Second Street. In fact, it was located one building away from another theater, the Strand Theater, which is located next to the Mount Foundation building. This was a seven-story building that was constructed during the silent movie era. And so, for the first few years, it showed silent movies. But then in 1929, after the State Theater was retrofitted to show talkies, we'll show the very first talkie movie shown at the State Theater. And you may recognize this ad. This is the original ad for the State Theater that the State Theater advertising person decided to draw personally. For example, you see the state name being held up by all those dancers here. And you see Al Jolson in character. And this is a very elaborate ad for the jazz singer, which, as you may recall, was the first talking movie, which came out in 1927. And as you can see, it was shown in Detroit for 13 weeks, 3 full months. Although it took a couple of years for it to finally make it to Flint. Then TV came along in the 1950s, and by 1952, this was the final double bill at the State Theater. As you can see, these are horror movies, not just horror movies, but re-releases of horror movies. Universal Pictures horror movies, which Real Art had the license to reissue these movies from Universal Pictures. Most of the State Theater was torn down, except for maybe the first 2 stories and the back wall. And if you look at the back wall of what is now Blackstone's Pub, there's an eternally open 3rd-story window. But Blackstone's Pub is actually in a high single-story building. And if you're ever in there, look at the walls, and you can still see bits and pieces of the State Theater inside Blackstone's Pub. Next slide, please. In the mid-1950s, the City Fathers conceived the Flint College and Cultural Center. And this was an early drawing of the Flint College and Cultural Center. You can see some of the familiar buildings. Now, there's Central High School here. There's Whittier Junior High over here. There's, well, Whiting Auditorium, but it did not look like that as it was built. And you can see what is now the Mount Community College facilities, but the building layout did not quite turn out that way. And one building that was never built was this Caroline Tower. The story was that the steel for that tower was stored inside the old Dort home, but when it burned down, there went those, there goes the steel, so there's no Caroline Tower inside the Flint Cultural Center. Go to the next slide. This is a landmark at the end of Hamburg Road, right by Interstate 69 and Flint Southwestern Academy. The rock was constructed as a pumping station because the intersection of 12th Street and Hamburg Road is below grade, so during heavy rains they needed that pumping station to keep the intersection from flooding. When Southwestern High School was built and Interstate 69 went through, it gave the rock more exposure. And starting in 1970, some Southwestern High schools decided to make the rock into a canvas. And over the period of years, new messages and new paintings, and well, let's just say that the people who painted over the rock didn't care about what paint they were using. They're using cheap paint, didn't care if it was oil-based or latex. Of course, oil-based paint and latex paint don't always stick together. And as you can see, on June 9th, 2014, it all peeled off. And amazingly, collectors picked up those flakes of paint. But it didn't take long for new messages like this one to appear on the rock. Sometimes, even if the paint is still wet, another group of people paint a new message on the rock. So, either way, Hammerberg Road was named after World War II hero Owen Hammerberg, who was killed rescuing some people from a sunken ship when a big piece of steel fell on him.
That was at Pearl Harbor, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
I talk about that in my book. And of course, Hammerberg Road was named in his memory. Next slide. Now this was at Sherwood Forest Park, which was located on Ridgefield Road in Ridgefield Township, east of State Road. It was developed by Don Sherwood from land he owned as a recreation area. But over a period of years, developed not just as a recreation area, but also as a concert venue. A stage was constructed, and as you can see, performances were held at, well, you can see the big crowd, which kind of rivaled Woodstock. So this was the crowd in 1970. I think I was there the following year, 1971. There was another big crowd. However, there were also drug dealers and vandalism, and the neighbors complained. In fact, there was a neighboring orchard, the Master's Orchard. He complained about the damage to his property, including some trees. So finally, the police decided we've had enough of it. Sherwood Forest eventually became a recreation area again, also a dinner theater inside the lodge where the stage was. But that did not work out, so Mother Nature took over. The buildings wound up burning down, so there's not much left of Sherwood Forest. You can barely see what was left of the entrance, but one piece does remain. That statue of Robin Hood, which greeted visitors to Sherwood Forest, is now on the parking lot of Ridgefield Township Hall on State Road. So that's the piece of Sherwood Forest that is still remaining.
Little John.
Yes?
Going back to Southwestern High School, back in the mid-1970s, a blacktop experiment was done from Hammerberg Road, from the block across Southwestern High School, up, I think just about the Fenton Road, long before the Vaudeville and glass recycling really caught on. They used ground glass in with the asphalt. They had a sign up at one point that talked about the new glass fault experiment.
Oh yes, I recall that. And back in the 1970s, in front of along 12th Street, by Southwestern, they did resurface that section of 12th Street with bits of broken glass, crushed glass, with the asphalt, and that's how it was called, glass fault. Unfortunately, that did not last, and when it was resurfaced, again, they just used conventional asphalt.
Whose fault was it?
Okay.
The county. Yeah, the county.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. The Four Nature Preserve and Arboretum is a very nice nature area in the city of Burton, located along Genesee Road and Davison Road. It's a very nice nature area. It was originally a dairy farm that was owned by Forbes and Martha Merkley, who owned Genesee Dairy. And they had a dairy farm which produced prized cows, but they kept most of the land in its natural state. And so Martha Merkley donated the land to Genesee County for use as a nature preserve. This is the latest addition to 4MR, the treehouse, which is fully handicapped accessible and is big enough to hold a group of pupils and a teacher. We'll go to the next slide. Now, as I mentioned, those buildings along East First Street were torn down to make way for Genesee Towers, which opened in 1968. That was at one time Flint's tallest building. across Brush Alley from the Mount Foundation building. But over a period of several years, the bank moved out, and it went through one owner after another owner after another owner. It turned out that the reinforced concrete building was shoddily built, so it deteriorated to the point where they had to put barricades around. In fact, there was also a parking deck inside the Genesee Towers, and I guess one car kind of got a little bit too forward, and a piece of facade fell onto the street. It got so bad that, well, next slide, it was imploded. And the implosion turned out beautifully. There were cameras set up at different angles. You can see it in detail in high definition on YouTube. And the 3-story pile of rubble looked better than Genesee Towers did in its final months. It took about a year for the rubble to be cleared and for the damage to the surrounding streets to be repaired, but there was very minimal collateral damage, which I was impressed about, as the Mount Foundation mill was just feet along Brush Alley, and it fell in the right direction, fortunately. And although a gas line serving the Mount Foundation building was crushed by the implosion, so there was no heat until the pipe was repaired. Next slide, please. Now, Flint was the home for a chain of auto parts and service centers which had locations throughout the state. And this roof here was trademarked. So that was on the gas station canopy and as well as on the buildings. You can still see examples of former Action Auto stores. For example, if you go to Clio to the Chrysler dealership, I wonder when Chrysler will finally tell the Chrysler dealership in Clio to change the building so it will look like a Chrysler dealership. Right now it still has that unique hip roof design. This particular Action Auto, which was torn down, was located on Ballinger Highway between the Flint River. In fact, that was right close by Old Calvary Cemetery, which I mentioned. That is now the location of a Dollar Tree store. In fact, one piece of the old Action Auto is still standing. The sign, which was grandfathered, it was refaced and is now the Dollar Tree store's sign. Next. Oh, by the way, what happened to Action Auto? Well, let's say that the owners, the Sabo brothers, kind of overextended themselves and they went bankrupt. The multiple bankruptcies caused, well, the feds to be interested, and they wound up doing time. Now, Flint nowadays is known for its several statues. There's a few statues downtown and other statues located in other areas. The editor of my Hidden History of Flint book wanted more interesting statues without any current cars being shown. So there's several photos of these statues commemorating the sit-down strike at Sit-Downs Memorial Park. They're in my book, commemorating the sit-downers as well as the Women's Emergency Brigade members who aided the sit-downers, wives and daughters of the auto workers. So they're in my book. The statues of Flint's automotive pioneers are located along Saginaw Street at the flat lot. They're the ones like Billy Durant, G. Dallas Stewart, Charles Stewart, Mott, Albert Champion. They're all along Saginaw Street. There's also a couple statues of Billy Durant and G. Dallas Stewart near their old factories on Water Street, right by the old Durant office building and Factory 1. And there's also a couple of statues of auto workers on the grounds of City Hall. But this is the most fascinating statue, Mahatma Gandhi. It's on the campus of the University of Michigan Flint at Wilson Park.
Was he an auto worker too?
No,
That's what he said.
but the Flint's Indian community paid for the making of the statue and its location at U of M Flint. And of course, Mahatma Gandhi was a very influential civil rights pioneer who led the Indian independence and influenced other people like Martin Luther King with their peaceful protests, which were non-violent. Next slide, please. Now, the next set of slides will wrap up my presentation about the Flint water crisis. But who do I blame? This man. real estate agent Claude Darby Sr. What he did, he bought some land along the Lake Huron shoreline in Worth Township in Satellite County for the location of a water intake pipe for a planned pipeline from Lake Huron to Flint to better serve the needs of the Flint area for water. Well, he sold the land to someone else, who resold the land to Darby on behalf of the city at a considerable profit. He got caught. He had to give up his capital gains, and he lost his real estate license. But to make a long story short, the city commission scrapped that planned pipeline and wound up buying water from Detroit instead. So over a period of several years, the water rates went up and up and up, and the county decided, we've had enough, let's build another pipeline. Well, I don't have to tell you what happened. But here's what happened with me. Last year in the spring, City of Flint residents were asked to let the water run for a few minutes to let the phosphates that should have been in the Flint River water, to let them coat the pipes, including my plumbing. Now, my house, I should mention, was built in 1941 and has a copper service line, not a lead service line. However, my plumbing, while it is copper, has mostly lead solder joints. And I made the mistake of using the bypass knob on the faucet filter in the kitchen. And so, now I first mentioned that the EPA action level for lead is 15 parts per billion, but at the test, which was in late May of 2016, it was 977 parts per billion of lead and 5,390 parts per billion of copper. That led to a surprise visit by 4 people, including a plumber, to inspect my plumbing. So I complained loudly, and I got help. This is my own kitchen faucet being replaced by a plumber and a plumber's helper from the Plumbers Union. So I was told by a state official that older faucets like that one here do contain lead. So not only did I get a brand new faucet, but I also got, next slide please, an under the sink faucet filter from the 3M company. You can get this faucet filter and this under the sink filter, I should say, as well as a replacement cartridge. You can get them at Lowe's, but they're kind of on the pricey side, but I can get them for free. The cartridge lasts for 6 months, and as you can see here, it reduces lead by 99%. And from that point on, my kitchen faucet has had no lead, and the last time my bathroom faucet was tested without the filter, the result was just 4 parts per billion of lead, so my bathroom faucet's fine, but of course I'm using a pure faucet filter in my bathroom. So I'm content, unlike some other people, but I should mention, well, first of all, have any of you seen that Lifetime TV movie about the Flint water crisis? Yeah. I saw it, of course, and I recorded it with the help of John. And I have my own issues with it. Sure, the story was very engaging, but they played around with facts. Now, this actor, Sandy Jobin Bevins, playing Flint Mayor Dane Walling, this was the scene. Now, that's obviously not the Flint water plant, but that's the scene where he flips the switch, switching from Detroit water to Flint water from the river. And they did not use corrosion control, as you know, and so you know what happened. So we'll go to the next slide. And this was in the movie the home of one of the early victims, Leanne Walters, the ones who had the brown water and the family having lead poisoning issues. But what's wrong with this house? Yeah, but the architectural style. This looks like this is a mid-20th century home. And as I mentioned, my own house that was built in 1941 has a copper service line. I don't think a house that looks like that was built in the mid-1950s, would have a lead service line, would have a copper service line. So this was the TV version of Leanne Walters' home. On the next slide, you can see the real house she lived in, which is much older, and obviously would have a lead service line underneath the front yard. Now we'll go to the next issue I have with that movie.
By the way, she left Flinn.
Oh yes, because she was married to a serviceman, she had to move to where he was stationed. So I wound up going to Virginia, I believe. Now, you may remember this is the Flint City Hall on South Saginaw Street, the way it's been standing since the mid-1950s. But that's not how it was depicted in the movie. Next slide. That is Hamilton, Ontario City Hall. Most of the movie was filmed in Hamilton. Which, well, you know that Hamilton is Flint's sister city. And during the summer, athletes from both cities and in those areas compete in the Canusa Games.
Yeah.
But you must admit that Hamilton City Hall looks much better than Flint City Hall. Now we'll go to the next slide and another issue I have. Now, remember that everything broke loose in 2015. But in 2015, you see these protesters from the movie and that Flint Lives Matter t-shirt that one protester is wearing. You couldn't go to a store unless it's a small t-shirt shop where you can get a custom shirt. You can go off the rack and get a Flint Lives Matter t-shirt at, say, a Target store or a Walmart. But you can easily get them the following year when the Flint Water became such a national newsbreak and even an international newsbreaker that the t-shirts became more easily available. Now we'll go to the next slide. And this is obviously a stock footage from the CNN archives of a protest, and also shows this is what became of the principals in the movie, not necessarily the real people. For example, it says here, Stephen Bush and several other MDEQ officials faced involuntary manslaughter charges due to the spread of Legionnaire's disease from poisoned water. And in that movie, only one emergency financial manager was depicted, Jerry Ambrose, but he wasn't the one who made the decision. Darnell Early made the decision to switch from Detroit water to river water. So, as it says here, Jerry Ambrose is among those charged with misconduct in office. Now, the actor who played Jerry Ambrose made a very great villain. His name was Richard Ross. He's a Canadian character actor. And over a decade ago, he did a miniseries for CBC television, which I watched and I enjoyed. I even got a DVD of it. He played a conservative commentator in a show called Jimmy McDonald's Canada. And as the episodes progressed, he got more and more annoyed at the material he was forced to cover. And in the final episode about the sexual revolution, after seeing video of elderly nudists, he snapped. So that was a fun show to watch. And it's great seeing Richard Wall playing Jerry Ambrose as the villain in that movie. And as you know, at the bottom, Dane Walling lost his re-election bid for mayor. And I guess that wraps up the presentation almost, except I should mention this is a vintage postcard on the top showing the future location of the University of Michigan Flint campus. There's the Palace Theater, there's the IME Auditorium, there was the original post office, which was originally it was first a post office, but then was the Community Service Center building. That's the old YMCA, that's the old Hubbard's Hardware Warehouse, but practically all these buildings are gone to make way for the U of M Flint campus. And this gentleman, that's the same Lloyd Copeman I mentioned, but in a more formal portrait. And that's my presentation.